There we go. Good to be with all of you. I'll share screen and we'll jump right in. Last time we got to talking about all kinds of deepness. Had the conversation really about the first half of chapter 5 of Gospel of Mark. We peeled back the layers on the good old Gerasene demoniac, and how Mark is most likely challenge us again with who is this Jesus, but also maybe pushing us on what does it mean to be oppressed or be dealing with people you don't like at the same time, right? Whether that's Gentiles or the Roman legions. Good old-fashioned Mark pushing. Do we have any thoughts or comments from last time that we want to look at?
Well, I thought one note I read that was kind of interesting was that, because we talked about how Mark had located this story quite some distance actually from the Sea of Galilee.
Right.
And so when Matthew adapts it, he changes the location. So yeah. It'll be, right, close to the lake of, the Sea of Galilee. So he's, I guess, not interested in the subplot.
Right. He didn't like it or didn't get it, or both, maybe, depending. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. So the remainder of the chapter is two stories that have been combined. We start with the story, we break away from that story to talk about another story, then we finish the first story. All right. So this is technically called an inclusio. You'll usually hear that for in biblical studies groups, or they'll talk about it as a bracketing structure. And then there's all these other terms that people use. The sandwich technique is my personal favorite, where they just say you sort of have two pieces of bread and then something different in the middle, right? It's the same thing regardless. That is, two stories are put together and are intrinsically connected and are really put together to inform each other. So hopefully they'll help us understand each other, right? One story is intentionally connected so that they can do this. And this happens Old Testament, New Testament, it happens all over the place. Mark is not alone in doing this by a long shot. It's all over the place. It's just always to see which ones are connected and how people have chosen to connect them. So here's what we'll do today, knowing this is the entire second half of the chapter. Last week we did that good old Gerasene demoniac. This week we'll look at these two stories, knowing that they've been intentionally put together by Mark to inform each other. And what we'll do then is what we're always asked to do in this case. I'll read the story, we'll reflect on it a little bit, but the bigger thing is to listen for details as we go along, because Mark intentionally put these together for his storytelling purposes, and now our job is to figure that out if we can, right? So we have to listen for details. What's similar between these two stories that Mark may well be saying, okay, I put these together because of this, but then there's also power in what's different, right? So sometimes that is equally informing, is to say, well, in one case this happened, in the other case that happened. Either way, Mark puts them together to challenge us. So let's see if he challenges us. Any questions before I start reading that second half? I'll just do the whole thing, and then we'll take it apart a little bit on the other side and talk about what's the same, what's different, what we think. All right. No questions? We'll go on then. So, beginning at the 21st verse, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the lake. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet. And he begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, if I but touch his clothes, I will be made well. Immediately, her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And that immediately, of course, is the euthus. Then immediately, euthus, aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowds pressing in on you. How can you say, who touched me? He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, Talitha cum, which means little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this moment, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Okay, so it's the end of the stories. The next part, Jesus goes home to Nazareth, and chapter 6 starts there. So this really is one set inclusio, one set beginning, middle, end. What do we hear that's similar in the story? What struck you about what's the same?
12 years.
Yeah. 12 years.
This is obvious, but healing.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Healing. Well, that's the whole point. A lot of times it is obvious. We don't have to go super deep to hear the things that are in common.
Both were females.
He went willingly to help, to heal.
There were skeptics. Some people say, why bother the teacher anymore? She's dead.
Right.
And in the case of the woman suffering from hemorrhages, she's been abused by physicians who've been taking her money and not getting her well.
Yeah. You could probably put the disciples in there. They're sort of like, what do you mean someone touched you? Everyone's touching you, right? What else? Other things that are similar or the same?
Well, it's the healing the touch is related to the healing.
Right. All right. So then the next natural question is differences. What was different between the stories?
One was in public, one was in private.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first one, the sick person touched Jesus, and the second one, Jesus touched the sick person.
Right.
Yeah, the older woman had, in essence, been taken advantage of by the people who were taking her money and not healing her.
How do we know that one?
Well, I'm part. It's clearer in the message, which says a long succession of physicians had treated her badly, taking all her money and leaving her worse off than before. NRSV isn't quite that explicit, but it says she had endured much
Right.
under many physicians and had spent all she had. She was no better, but rather grew worse.
Yeah, King James says, suffered many things of many physicians and had spent all she had. Okay.
Right.
Nothing bettered, rather grew worse.
Mhm.
What I hear different is the last sentence, which has echoes of what Jesus tells the disciples. You give her something to eat.
Right.
Also, don't tell anyone,
Mm-hmm.
which is a theme throughout Mark.
It is that.
Okay, and the story with the woman was about faith. Your faith has made you well. Okay, I don't know if it's similar or not, because the father, of course, okay, must have also had faith because he came to get Jesus to heal his daughter. So but that one you kind of have to read between the lines.
Right.
There's water in a boat in the first story, which isn't similar to the second story, the middle story, but it is similar to lots of other stuff in Mark.
Mm-hmm. Yep. All right. Anything else for pros, or not pros or cons, but similar or different?
They're both great stories.
They're both great stories. Well, and they're both stories no one else can heal but Jesus, right? On a similarity. Whether the doctors were taking advantage of the woman or not in the first story, Jesus is the only person who can raise somebody from the dead. Jesus is the only person who can heal this woman's bleeding, right? Or at least we learned that by the end.
But it's interesting, when the woman touched his garment, she immediately felt she was already healed. But then Jesus said to her, when he talked to her, go and be whole, as if that was when she was healed. But she really had been healed just based on her touch.
Wow. Yeah.
And her faith.
Right.
I'm trying to remember if I've heard one story or both stories or neither story in the lectionary. I feel like I have.
I feel like yes, but I'd have to go back and look.
Okay, because my question was going to be, is the full sandwich or inclusio in the lectionary, or are they divided up?
Do that. It's a good question. I'll look it up as we talk here.
They're divided up because I remember there was just a story of the woman. Okay. And that wasn't that long ago. Okay. So I think they're split, Craig.
Okay. Just curious.
Yeah, it's a really long story, but yeah. It looks like actually, let's see, when was that? Proper 13 it's the full thing.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
June 27th was when it was supposed to be
Yeah.
read. I was out of town, so I can't say if we'd read it or not.
It wasn't that long ago. I knew it wasn't that long ago. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts before I'll do a little more history and context, and then we'll tackle it some more that way. All right. So again, like we all said, these are great stories. They're fabulous stories. Some context, right? Jesus returns to the Jewish side of the lake. Some of this is obvious, but it's just to name it, right? When he was over in Gerasene or wherever he was on the east side, that was very clearly Gentile territory. Now he's on the Jewish side. He came back to the Jewish side of the lake. And to reinforce that, in case we didn't catch it, who's the first person Jesus meets? A leader of a synagogue, right? I mean, it's almost like, hey, he came back and then he met a leader of a synagogue, like boom, boom. Crowds are pressing on him, which is basically what he left for, or at least that was the idea of why he left. He was getting worn out by everybody constantly trying to touch him and be near him. And we have this same thing right as soon as he comes back. We should think of Jesus sort of as, I don't know, the Beatles or any sort of famous person we can think of now, right? Everybody just the mad dash and crush to be next to him, near him, right on top of him. And in such a way that he's clearly, the terms that are used, right? They're pressing in on him, they're jostling him, there's movement, all that kind of stuff. It's not a comfortable place to be, right? He's just in this scrum of people. So then, we always have to look at names. Jairus, only mentioned one time, means God enlightens. He's the only person who's named, and even he is only named one time. After that, he's just the leader of the synagogue, right? After that, his name disappears. He's just a leader. Everyone in this is nameless, which is interesting. Sometimes names show up, but Mark doesn't have a lot of names. It just tends to be the nameless other people, because Jesus is the only one that Mark is really super concerned about.
A quick question, Bill.
Yeah.
Were rabbis weren't yet part of the Jewish religion, were they?
There were local gatherings of community. I don't know when the term, well, rabbi clearly was part of the terminology at this point, because all four gospels have Jesus called as rabbi or teacher,
rabbi, right.
right? But I don't know if they had the authority or the understanding of leadership that they have now.
Okay. What is the leader of a synagogue then? I guess is my question.
Right. I think it would be a rabbi, but when you had the temple and all the priests and leadership were in the temple in Jerusalem, it would be sort of like, well, these are the second tier guys, right? The rabbis were not the best of the best. They went to Jerusalem. If you were a rabbi out in Galilee, then you were probably second or third tier, right? You were the B League single A baseball team, right? You were in the system, but he's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So one thing, and this was noted by a couple of people, he comes right to Jesus's face and convinces him to follow his to heal his daughter, right? Literally begging Jesus to come and heal it. And we talked a little about that, right? Like that he seems to believe, but he also just seems to be willing to do just about anything. So that's really the sort of opening part. Then we switch all of a sudden. I mean, it's quick. It's 2-3 verses for that. We immediately switch to the hemorrhaging woman, which talk about, I mean, things none of us would want to be known for. Like, hey, I was the bleeding woman in the Bible. You maybe have heard of me. Like, no name, nothing. Just she bleeds. Poor thing. She's bled for 12 years, like we noted. And 12 is one of those numbers that obviously is important in Scripture. It is a whole number, right? There's the 12 tribes of Israel. There's 12 days. There's all these kinds of different things that people have put out there for 12. All we can say for sure, of course, is that it's probably more symbolic than necessarily an exact number of years. That is to say, she's bled for a long time, for a really long and full time. But who knows exactly how many days, weeks, that kind of stuff. And so we need to talk though for a minute, because this always comes up. We need to talk for a moment about Jewish purity laws, because if you've ever heard this preached or taught, you usually end up hearing about Jewish purity laws, because there's lots of them about hemorrhaging, and of course, more specifically, women in their periods, right? Because that's what this is all a reference to. So people often talk about how Jesus openly flouts purity laws and is thus condemning them. That's how it gets preached a lot, that Jesus isn't afraid to touch this woman who has bled for 12 years, even though she would be ritually unclean. And he touches the dead girl on the bier, because, and that is, you know, she's unclean because of the dead body and all that kind of stuff, right? And it's so it often then is this idea that Jesus has overturned those old Jewish purity laws. And it's how it gets preached a lot. Not universally, but variations on that theme, right? So my good friend and scholar Amy Jill Levine sees this as a pretty anti-Semitic, or a great deal of this is anti-Semitic. And I actually agree with her, because that's literally nowhere does he say that the laws are terrible. And he doesn't say it here. And it's not even a subtext here. I mean, it might be somewhere back in the line, right? That some of the people in the first century would have known about purity law. Well, they all would have known likely about purity laws, but it's not, Jesus is all, he doesn't seem to have a problem with saying like, this is a dumb law and I will fix it or something. You know, like he's not afraid to challenge Pharisees, Sadducees, the temple guards, you name it. Everyone, he will push and say exactly what he's about. What it ends up typically being, though, is trying to cast Jesus, who, let's be honest, was Jewish, as someone other than Jewish, right? That he was coming in to bring this new faith that was against all those terrible purity laws. Except for Jesus on several occasions says things like, I didn't come to overturn the law, and I didn't come to overturn the prophecies. I came to confirm every jot and tittle, is the line, which literally is sort of like saying, I came to cross every T and dot every I of the law. I'm going to fulfill all the law. I'm not here to overturn it. If we're really listening to the totality of Jesus's message, then that's why I agree with AJ. It tends into this narrative that Christians like to talk about and say, oh, look, Jesus came and overturned those laws, when really there's plenty else that's important that Jesus is saying, but it's not necessarily about that. Okay. Again, Jesus never says anything about those purity laws. Now, what we can say on the other side, we definitely have moments like these readings where Jesus might be crossing some barriers, right? That there's some issue here that if a woman had a perpetual bleed like this, then she would be ritually unclean. And a dead body would be ritually unclean as well. And so to touch a woman who is perpetually bleeding, or to be touched by her, and to touch a dead body, or to be in a room with a dead body, was to be made ritually unclean. That is accurate. Okay. But does anyone know how someone who is unclean is made clean under Jewish law?
Wash up.
Yep. Yeah. Take a bath. That's it. It's not really complex. The way it gets taught with a lot of preachers and teachers is, oh, Jesus will be unclean and it's terrible, and then he's unclean and he's cast out. And no, he goes and takes a bath. It's not this horrendous moment that has made him unable to do anything ever again. That's a fatal misunderstanding of Jewish law and practice, right? Now, again, to be fair, if you know anyone who's Jewish, they will touch a dead body of someone they love and sit Shiva for days. That is, they will grieve and they will sit in the midst of that difficult situation, and they will be ritually unclean to support and love the people who are dealing with death. That's the image that we actually get in this reading when there's great wailing and crying, that all these people are super upset because this young girl died, right? It is not one that they said, oh, she is now separated from the community, or the father of the synagogue is now separated from the community. No, well, yes, but the same way we all are when someone we love dies, right? Something terrible has happened and they're just recognizing that something has changed. So again, this is just to peel back some of those layers that again, I'm trying to undo some bad preaching, quite frankly, or some misunderstanding, both, of how this works. After you've set Shiva, you take your bath, you take your mikvah, and then you reset and you're welcome back into the community. With the knowledge and understanding that something extraordinary has happened and you need extra love and support and care. Just the same way we would do in a Christian community without maybe the bath, but everything else, right? We'd be happy to sit and go and take food and be with someone dealing with that, especially if it's someone we love. So it's not condemnation, not a separation from community, certainly for the dead girl, right? It's important to say that Jesus is not doing anything brave to touch the young girl who has died to raise her up. Now he's doing something extraordinary and healing her to raise someone from the dead. That's the important part. And this is where I find that some of this, sometimes when people preach about purity laws, they have chopped down the trees despite the forest kind of thing. Like, what are you doing? Like, the important thing is Jesus literally raised this girl from the dead. That's what's important, not that he happened to touch a dead body. Yeah, I can touch a dead body. Any of us can touch a dead body. That doesn't mean anything. And yeah, we're ritually unclean. Okay, fine. But none of us are raising her up from the dead. That's the part that's fascinating and amazing. And what does it mean for our lives together, right? So it's a weird kind of way to do that. Questions. I mean, this is, again, I'm trying to just reset some of this so that we can have the conversation about what matters.
I think also important about the hemorrhaging woman, he heals her too.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly.
I mean, the whole point of the story is that she's healed, not that she touched him. Okay, so
exactly. Or that she was ritually impure, right? Nowhere does the text say this
Doesn't say
ritually
anything about
impure
her.
woman.
exactly.
What's important is the healing, which is what we said, right? From the start, we said what's
Right.
similar, that the obvious, right?
The healing.
They're
right.
healed.
They're
They're
healed.
both healed, and no one else but Jesus can do it. No, there's not a doctor in the world that can help this woman, and there's not a person in the world who could raise someone from the dead. Jesus alone can help these two women, and he does. That's the important part, but we get caught up in some of this weird sidelong preaching about trying to make Jesus extra special, I guess, or to lay a certain, not explicitly anti-Semitic, but a certain way of trying to portray Jesus as a boundary breaker. And he is a boundary breaker. He raised her from the dead. No one else can do that. That's breaking a pretty significant boundary, but it's not a Jewish Christian boundary.
Mhm.
All right, so we'll go back and look a little bit about the bleeding woman. She was ritually unclean and would be required to keep her distance. Okay, so this was true. If any of you have read the book, The Red Tent, wonderful book that really talks about how Jewish law was, or at least theorizes, I guess it's fiction, but it's a good midrash story about how that probably would have worked, right? The Red Tent is all about how women during menstruation have to go to a very specific place, the red tent, and be separated while they're bleeding. This woman had a situation where she was always bleeding, so she was constantly separated from community, right? She'd be required to keep her distance, but again, at no point is that mentioned in the text. I think it is fair to say if you were a first century Jew, you would have known that she would have been separated from the community, but it's not what Mark emphasizes or what Jesus emphasizes, right? But it is important to know in this case, so while first century Jewish listeners would know that, they would be sad that she was separated from the community, right? They would see the tragedy not in, oh, Jewish law prevents her from being connected to anyone. They'd say, oh, this is so sad, she's sick. Right? She's bleeding for 12 years. That's horrible. That's the horrible part of it, right? Not purely that Jewish law requires her to be separated. In the first century, they don't have modern medicine, right? You also had to separate lepers. And it was just to prevent disease. They didn't understand how all that stuff worked. They just knew that she wasn't well, but they didn't want to come in contact with her because it might make them sick. And this is where Placker again sort of comes in and says, this is probably the most analogous thing is in the late 80s, early 90s with AIDS patients, right? Like family members didn't feel like they could touch their loved ones because they didn't know how it was spread and they were terrified they were going to get it. And it was not that anyone was suddenly saying, oh, this is the horrors of X, Y, and Z. It was just that they didn't, it was pure fear. Like, we don't know how this spreads. The safe way we can be safest is to care for you by bringing you food, but I can't touch you, right? Or I can be in the room, but I'll be wearing every mask, gown, and option possible, but can't physically embrace you, which of course was the great tragedy of a lot of the AIDS epidemic, was family members didn't feel like they could give their beloved a hug or hold their hand as they died.
And it went from that all the way up to the villainization of patients.
Of course. But I think it's fair then to say, if we're going to read this in any sort of context, it might be more akin to that, which is not, again, a condemnation of the medical system to make an equivalent sort of connection, or Jewish law. It's just to say the tragedy here is that she was an isolated, sick woman for decades plus.
And the same was true of the man that was possessed. I mean, he was living
Yes.
separate from the community in the tombs.
Literally a dead man walking. Yeah, quite literally. That, again, this is how both of those work, right? So
Which
she spent, yeah.
which were advised, crowds were pretty large. It took a lot of bravery for her to approach Jesus, I'm sure.
Yes. Yeah. So she spent, we'll get to that in just a second, but she spent all her money to be made well. We know that, right? So she was wealthy. It didn't work. But again, I'm just trying to give a clear indication of Jewish purity laws. They are there. They do matter. They're part of the Jewish community, but they're not the animating force the way that it's sometimes preached and taught by Christians who don't understand them or haven't worked with folks around them. And I will say, one of the greatest gifts of my life, I worked for 6 years at the Memphis Jewish Community Center as a lifeguard, so nothing profound. But I learned lots about Jewish purity laws because I was there every day, and not every day, but most days, all summer long. And then a lot of times actually through the school year, I learned lots about purity laws, and it was usually just like, well, go wash your hands, like it was not a profound thing. And it was just a way of honoring God most of the time and honoring tradition than it was necessarily this, condemnation and horrible answer. Now that's the 21st century. We have different understandings of a lot of those things, but even in the first century, it's probably much the same. It was just a way to try and say, let's make sure people are safe. All right. So looking ahead, I think I beat up on purity codes enough. He does not break the purity codes, right? Or at least not completely. The woman, desperate to be healed, risks the anger of her community for being in the crowd and touching people.
Yes.
It is not Jesus that, this is what I find really fascinating, honestly, about when people go, oh, Jesus bravely unveils the purity codes. Like, well, no, the woman does it. She's the one who's so desperate to be healed.
Right.
She will risk the condemnation and anger of her community just to touch Jesus, which she knows she's not supposed to do, right? She knows she's not supposed to do that. She's the one who breaks the purity codes in a desperate gamble to be healed. Which again, for me, that's a much more powerful way to look at the story than to look at it as Jesus somehow overturning religious tradition. It takes a lot more bravery for her than it does for Jesus to do anything. She breaks the rules. She touches Jesus, right? So William Placker notes powerfully that Jairus approaches from the front and the woman has to sneak up from behind. Right? That's a difference between the two stories. The head of the synagogue can ask directly. She has to sneak up. even get a chance to talk to Jesus. I don't know, have anything more on it than that. I just found it I think Clacker did a good job of just noting that, right? Like that's an interesting difference in approach. And probably the way, let's be honest, the world works, right? The people who are wealthy and powerful tend to be able to ask directly. And if you don't have money or resources, she's dead broke, having spent it all on trying to be healed. They have to come in sideways or from behind or any way they can. Here's the key phrase, right? Her faith makes her well. That's what Jesus says. And it's not, Jesus does not use any formula. He doesn't spit on the ground, smear mud on her face, anything. It's literally just like he is electric on some degree or level, right? She feels that electricity go into her, that power go into her. He feels it come out of him. And even in the Greek, he basically, it could be translated not just who touched me, but which woman touched me. He seems to know that it was a woman because he uses a female pronoun for it. The who in that case has a feminine ending. And then we all missed, no one said this, Jesus calls her daughter. So they are both daughters. One is the daughter of the synagogue. But Jesus explicitly calls her daughter, your faith has made you well. He adopts her because of her faith. Or if we are again to look at purity laws, she has been in a situation where she hasn't been able to be connected to people. The healing he gives her is not just physical, but then in that just saying daughter says you're back in the community, right? Beloved daughter, part of this community, welcome home.
That could be part of the reason Jesus said to her, that whole statement about you're healed, go in pieces, so that everybody else around would do that.
Right.
I mean, she
already
knew it. But
yeah. I think that's perfect, Marcy. Yeah, that's exactly it. Because he knows he healed her. She knows she's been healed. That they could have just ended at that. But the whole point then is that next level of making sure the whole community knows that she is now well. Yeah, absolutely. I hadn't caught that at all, but yes, that is absolutely part of it. So while the Jewish purity laws are out there, the greater story is in healing and risking everything to be healed. Because let's be clear, the little girl is not so little. At 12, she would be the age to marry in the first century. She would have gone through a bat mitzvah, or at least been probably betrothed. We tend to think of her as a little girl, and certainly in the 21st century. I don't want my 12-year-old son getting married to anyone, but that in the first century, you were of age. It was time to get you on with your life, get you out of the house, which is crazy, but that's how it worked. All right, so the words Jesus uses to raise her up are the same exact words used for his resurrection. He does not just say get up, he says aneste, like she was raised up. Christ was also raised up from the grave. It's the same verb, it's the same term. We should hear in that moment that Jesus is literally resurrecting her. Right? So again, that's the power of the moment. We're to see and hear this as a resurrection from the dead. And so the exact same thing they do, not in the Gospel of Mark, but in John, right? In the other Gospels, whenever Jesus shows up, he's like, hey, can I have a sandwich? He's risen from the dead. And it's almost to prove that she is not a spirit, right? It is not a spiritual resurrection. Hey, I just raised her from the dead. Give her something to eat to prove that she is physically resurrected. Not just spiritually, that this is not a ghost that I've raised up. This is a person. And both women, again, it's not explicitly said, but they're restored to both life, a whole life, and in that process restored to community. Right? In both cases, they can go back to being regular functioning parts of their community. That's the power of every one of Jesus's healings we've seen so far, right? Not just, oh, well, he got him out of the, he got those demons out of him and he's all good now. It was also, no, go back to your people and tell them what happened, or go back and show the priests that you've been healed of leprosy and you can be part of the religious community, part of the community again. The same is true for these women, right? Well, they're not told not to tell anybody. Fat chance that's happening. Hey, we just saw someone resurrected from the dead. Don't tell anybody. Yeah, right. But they are brought back to that full life in the community, especially the woman who's been hemorrhaging, who has been separated. Okay, so thoughts about all of that, and then we're going to shift one more time to talk about the women themselves. Anything for this first part? It's such a great story. There's great stuff.
Well, the NRSV Study Bible footnotes talk about this as being symbolic of Jesus, restoration of Israel. We've got the 12 years, 12 tribes kind of notion that her confidence, this is speaking of the woman who's been bleeding, her confidence that she would be healed is a paradigm of trust or faith in the renewal that is happening through Jesus. And then the young woman at 12, approaching marriage, appears to be dead, yet Jesus restores her to life and presumably the ability to reproduce new life in and of Israel, which reminds me of commentaries I've read before, which are that talk about what at the time people did not look at this being about individual. There was no notion of individual salvation.
Yeah.
It was for the community. It was for the people of Israel.
Absolutely. If not the world, right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so one last turn here that I found when I was doing my research. So my favorite conversation or insight about this is around faith and believing. So this comes straight from William Placker, who rightfully says, we worry about who Jesus is, and that's certainly the main thrust of Mark's book, right? That is, who is this Jesus? And I think that is still the question at the end of this chapter, right? We have seen him heal a demoniac, right? I mean, cast out demons, save a Gentile man. We've seen him heal a hemorrhaging woman, raise a girl from the dead. Who is this Jesus? That is still the question. But this is also where in the 21st century, we get into this sort of weird spot of intellectual assessment. Like if I agree intellectually that Jesus is God, then that's faith or that's believing, right? Except both of these women do this, but they never ask who Jesus is, right? Neither of these stories talk about who Jesus is or even ask the question. Instead, they just sort of jump in. This woman goes and touches Jesus thinking, if I can just touch him, then I will be healed. And so the question then is this woman's faith superstition, right? Is it just sort of like, well, I've heard, I believe that something can happen. And the response that I found powerful was from Theodore Jennings. It is, but there is something else here. She bets everything on a desperate gamble. That is faith. That is the only faith she had. It is sheer audacity.
Mm-hmm.
So when Jesus says, your faith has made you well, sometimes in the 21st century, we'll say, oh, she knew she knew Jesus was God. She knew he was divine. No. Faith is saying, I'm going to take a leap here. I'm going to try something extraordinary, believing that something could happen, right? It's a sheer audacity. It is a jump into what we think might happen, but ultimately the unknown. Like she could intellectually say, I think he can heal me. That's what she says. But that's all she says. She doesn't have this sort of, oh, here's the creed and I therefore believe and understand who Jesus is, right? So when we talk about faith and belief in the Gospel of Mark, it is not with a definition of who Jesus is. Instead, it is this. It's a desperate gamble. It is a sheer audacity. It is just following, right? So we can say too, on the other side, right? Jairus does not come up and say, Jesus, you are our Messiah, and Lord, you are truly God among us. He begs for his child's life. I will do anything for you to heal my daughter. I don't even necessarily know who you are. I've just heard you can help, so I will do anything to take care of her, right? As any parent would. It's sheer desperation. And so Placker then is right in noting, and I think this is the powerful part, understanding Jesus's identity is important. It's Mark's central purpose, after all, is to tell who Jesus is, but it does not come first. First, we have to and obey and follow. Now, I don't know if I necessarily would use Placker's words of trust, obey, and follow, but it's certainly our first role as Christians is not to have an intellectual assent to everything that Jesus is. It's to say, I'm going to start following and seeing what's going on, which is the invitation I think Mark's ultimately giving us as he tells this story, right? Keep hearing the stories, keep following. You'll see, keep going. You'll get there or you won't get there, but that's the only way you're ever going to get there is if you try just out of sheer desperation, out of audacity, out of hope. How do you follow, right? Because that's ultimately what's happened at every point. The disciples just get up and follow him, right? There's not anything about like, oh, I am the Lord and you should follow me and I will make you all these wonderful things. It's just, come on, let's go. And so faith and belief that in Mark, so far, his definition is not intellectual assent. It is just getting there and trying.
Yeah, it reminds me of discussions that faith and belief are not about, they're not cognitive concepts. I mean, they're sort of the question is, do you bet your life on it?
Yep.
Yeah, question. We know that at this point in time in history, women were not thought, were subservient. And, it's a very patriarchal society. And so what are the implications that Mark is sharing these two stories, both about women?
Oh, I think it's exactly right there in front of us. It's exactly the way you said it. I think it's that, hey, guess what? Women are part of this movement too. And Jesus did not preclude them or exclude them.
Mm-hmm.
And let's also be honest, this is where sometimes we maybe go a little overboard on the patriarchal system. It absolutely was patriarchal. Women absolutely were subservient. But women have always been part of every religious movement.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so that's another one of those areas that people can act like, oh, well, Jews didn't do this or wouldn't allow that for women. It's like, well, yeah, they did. There are plenty of Jewish faithful women. That's not an exception to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very explicit here. And I think Mark's telling the story intentionally around let's be honest, is a pretty delicate subject in the first century and still in the 21st century about menstruation and bleeding and all that kind of stuff. Explicitly to say like, yeah, I went there and that's part of who women are and Jesus doesn't have a problem with that. Why should you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's all of that is right there at the surface. I don't think you have to dig real deep to say that Mark is telling these stories together in part to say that women at any stage are part of the story. Mm-hmm. And part of his ministry.
And you could almost hang more significance on his use of the word daughter in light of this.
Yes.
He's not just saying beloved or child or something like that just to involve her in community or reintegrate her into community. He's referring to her as a feminine member of the community.
Well, and there's something possessive about daughter, right? Like just, oh, sweet little girl, or how are you, my friend, or something like that is much more open-ended. Daughter has this incredibly intimate declaration, right? Like, no, you're my daughter. You are my beloved person who is central to my personality and existence, right? Like, and it goes right back to when Jesus was saying, or actually that's in the chapters ahead. I get confused because we're preaching about Mark this year too.
Yeah.
But it's that moment where he says, who's my family? Oh, my family are those who follow my will. So yeah, she's my daughter. She has faith. And she tried all this. She's crazy, and she's crazy enough to get right in the system with me. Yeah. So next week we look at Jesus going home to Nazareth, where they reject him. Now the funny thing is, a lot of scholars will say that this is another larger inclusio narrative sandwich, because you had he's rejected in Gerasene or Gerasa, and he's then rejected in Nazareth. In between, you have two women who believe. So that goes to what you're saying, Nettie, right? Like, if you look at this as a larger inclusio within an inclusio, which is or that sandwich, narrative sandwich, then you have unbelieving Gentiles and you have unbelieving Jews on either side, and who's faithful? The two women in between.
Okay, Bill, I don't, when you say he was rejected, okay, in by the Gerasene, right? Not in Gerasene, okay.
Yeah.
He was rejected by the Gerasene. That was more fear. I don't know he was rejected. They were frightened of him.
Sure. Well, yeah. They're just
I wouldn't
afraid
call
of
it a rejection. Jesus is feared, okay, by that's more than I think he was rejected. Would you agree with that?
I'd agree with that. I think that's fair.
But
I think it's also, it is in opposition to the blind faith of the women and the people in the story today, though.
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, there was a reluctance to see the status quo disturbed.
Right. Right. Yeah, they're not happy about him being there. I'm happy to say that too, right? They were not happy about him being there. And reject may be the strong word, but it is in contrast to these women and the dad, both, who were all faithful and believe despite everything around them saying this is crazy.
Right. Okay.
So
Gotcha.
I do think we can nuance that a little, but I do think it's still there. Like, I mean, he goes home to Nazareth and they're all like, who's this cat? Not to give away next week. But I mean, you have on both sides that same kind of thing. And so I do think it's powerful to then sort of double down, even with the women in that case, to say, hey, they weren't sure about him and they were afraid of him in Gerasa and Gerasene, and at his own hometown, they're not real sure about him and what he's doing. But here's a group of people who, maybe out of desperation, but certainly out of a lot of hope and faith, just jump right in. Who are we then called to be, right? That's the implicit question that Mark is asking. Are we going to be afraid of the status quo being overturned, like the folks in Gerasene? And I can say, yeah, sometimes I am. When we really listen to Jesus, sometimes it's a little terrifying when he talks about all that's going to be overturned. And then on the other side, are we willing to believe that he was able to do this stuff? Because the folks in Nazareth don't really buy into all the deeds of power. Good stuff. As always, Mark gets us right there in the middle of it. Without, as always, God bless Mark, does not give us that answer or make it easy. He puts it in front of us, and now, what do you guys think? Good luck. Any other thoughts, questions? We're getting close to time. Just wanted to open it back up.
Well, both stories end with directions from Jesus. So in one case, it says, live well, live blessed. That's the message. So she's moved from brokenness through a point of recognition to new life, and now she's to live whole. But then with the 12-year-old, it ends after he says, arise, or whatever, give her something to eat. So it closes with this notion of the responsibility of the community to continue this process of raising her up.
Yes. I think both are true. Yeah.
And I would add that all three healing stories sort of overall showed Jesus as God's authority for everything, like demons and death and, you know, our physical well-being, our health, that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes that number 12 then is the most commonly thing I saw the most often is that 12 is sort of God's wholeness. It's a number of God's wholeness because it's 3 4s. But anyway, it's that sort of idea that this is a whole number that symbolizes God's authority and power. So that 12 years of bleeding and 12 years of the young girl could also be that sort of, again, that exactly what you're saying, Marcy, right? Like, this is, no, God's in charge. It doesn't matter if it's death or illness or demons, you name it. It's all God's in charge, has total dominion. Good stuff, my friends. All right. Well, hey, we'll see you next week. We'll look at Nazareth and see how they do.
Bye-bye.
Oh,
Thank you, Bill.
we already know, Bill. We
We'll
already
go
know
through that
that.
part.
Bill.
We'll
That's
go
okay.
through that one fast.
Okay, all right.
Thanks, Bill.
Okay.
Take care, y'all. We'll see you soon.
Later, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.